Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you for tuning into the show today. We're going to have a great show. We have the incomparable Douglas Dietrich coming on to talk to about one of his many topics. We're going to be talking about the Third Reich and how it never died. I don't know what's with that, but we are going to find out. But don't forget, you can listen to Just Energy Radio live every Thursday evening from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here live on the Inception Radio Network. But if you miss an episode, you can check out our webpage, www.justenergyradio.com, where we have close to 7 years worth of archives where you can download them for free. You don't have to sign up for anything, or you can go to our YouTube page, Just Energy Radio on YouTube.com. If you go to the webpage, please sign up for our newsletter to keep you informed of what's coming up. Or if you go to YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. We have, all right, as of last week, and I haven't checked in the last day or so, almost 2,000 subscribers. So we really would like to take that over to the top. So please do sign up and subscribe to that channel. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics, where you can learn to become a medical intuitive counselor, or energy medicine practitioner. A couple of very quick announcements, and we're going to get Douglas on the air. Next weekend in spooky Jefferson, Texas, is the History, Haunts, and Legends Conference. That is Saturday, November 2nd in spooky Jefferson, Texas. I'll be there speaking. Larry Flaxman will be speaking there. There's a number of people who have been on the show that are going to be there. And then after the day part of the conference, they are doing a ghost walk plus investigation. So if you wanted to go on a ghost hunt, this is your opportunity. It's always a lot of fun. I highly recommend that event. And then the following week in Marshall, Texas, I'll be speaking at the Marshall Paracon, and that's being held in Marshall, Texas. And then the big excitement is from March 20th. It's one of those months next year, March 20th through the 30th, or 22nd through the 30th, I and a group of people, which could include you, have the opportunity to go to Cambodia and see the cool complex at Angkor Wat and a number of different sites around that location. And so for more information about that, please do go to ancientmysteriesconference.com. They are offering some discounts right now up through, I think, Thanksgiving, offering like $300 or $400 off the ticket price. And it is probably one of the lowest conference tours on the market today. And it's not just me. There are other people going to be there speaking as well. And so check it out, buy a ticket, and come with us. It is going to be so cool. We'll get to touch all of that old stuff. I love it. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about Douglas and get him on the air. For 8 years, Douglas Dietrich was a research librarian for the Department of Defense at El Presidio Real de San Francisco military base. There, along with his primary duty of document destruction, he was assigned to locate and access incredibly rare occult Gilmores for the officially recognized satanic chaplain of the United States Army. You know, I'm going to have to ask him about that. Lieutenant Colonel Michael A. Aquino. Douglas will speak about occultism, Satanism within the U.S. military, and today we're going to be talking about the Third Reich. His webpage is www.douglasdietrich.com, so please welcome to Just Energy Radio, Douglas Dietrich. Hey, Douglas, how are you?
I'm doing fine, ma'am. Much the better for being here. And as I've explained to the dear Dr. Rita, I'm very much a creature of the night, and I'm still sucking in oxygen and caffeine to try and get some blood circulation to my brain so that I can be here more coherently.
Well, you know, I just like having a pretty high energy show, so I'm just going to send out good vibes and good high energy, and we're just going to get you ramped up. So,
yes, ma'am.
I mean, we're going to talk about the Third Reich, but I have to ask you about this thing in your bio where there's two parts that I have questions about.
Yes, ma'am.
One, destroying documents. I thought they're not supposed to do that. That's part one. And then what is this occult stuff for the Satanic Chaplain and Michael Aquino? What's that about?
Well, thank you very much for asking. In a sense, they're both interconnected. What happened was that Colonel Michael Aquino, he retired as a full colonel, but he initially started off as a lieutenant colonel when I was liaising with him under orders. What happened was I was a Department of Defense research librarian. I started off essentially as a librarian's aide with a summer job when I was 16 years of age. And the reason that I was allowed to do this was because I had what was known as a military dependence ID. That means that I had the ability to enter or exit any open military base, which technically the Presidio military base was, so long as I didn't go near any classified areas that were forbidden for obvious reasons, security reasons. And because I had this ability to enter the post exchange, the Letterman Army Medical Center as a patient, and the Letterman Army Medical Center was very important because that trained 25% of all the United States Army's doctors. The Presidio military base itself was very important because it was the Western Defense Command Center, which meant that it was responsible for the organization of defense for the United States occupied Kingdom of Hawaii and also for the 15 to 17 Western states of the United States, depending on jurisdiction as it changed over the years. Ultimately, the base was closed due to a number of very appalling scandals, and in a sense, Colonel Aquino was involved with those scandals by reputation, although he was never convicted of any crimes. His chaplaincy in Satanism for the U.S. military was very interesting because what happened was he converted to the First Church of Satan, which was established by Magus Anton Szandor LaVey, very famous San Francisco figure, and Magus Anton Szandor LaVey established the church in the year of my birth, 1966. And when Colonel Aquino joined, it was around 1967. And he went back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he was training in psychological warfare operations with the John F. Kennedy School of Special Warfare. And he immediately converted a number of his fellow officers and began conducting rituals on-site the military base. Now, when he was dispatched to Vietnam in country, what was known as the Third Corps Tactical Zone near Saigon, they asked him to prove how his occult rituals might be efficacious. So he channeled what was known as a grimoire, which was that word that you were puzzling over. A grimoire is simply a cult or ancient Latin term for grammar. It's simply a book of spells, kind of like a recipe book, if you will. So when he channeled these various entities that were all big names in the occult, he didn't go for anything small. He channeled what he claimed were 8 very major demons or devils, Lucifer, Satan himself, the Beelzebub, Asmodeus, Leviathan, and of course he developed what became known as the Diabolicon. Now, the Diabolicon was something that he said he could use to make up for the Army's program, which was failing. If you ever watch the film Apocalypse Now, there's a scene where Colonel Xavier Kilgore is attacking a Viet Cong occupied village, and they have stereo sounds that are blasting the Flight of the Valkyries. That scene was inspired by a real program of the United States Army, which was to use stereo systems in helicopters to disorient the Viet Cong by playing very loud demonic screams over the field. Now, it was a rule of thumb, quite literally, for the Viet Cong to just stick their thumb up in the air, and if the helicopter were larger than their thumb, then it was close enough to be hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. So they would often take down these helicopters, and the United States Army was losing, of course, because these helicopters were such easy targets. When they're blaring these loud screams, the stereos are playing, there's nothing that's more of a sitting duck than a hovering helicopter in the sky that's engaged in such foolishness. So the U.S. Army was losing helicopters, crews, and probably most alarmingly of all to them, expensive stereo equipment. So they went to Colonel Aquino and said, what can you do about this? And by channeling the Diabolicon, he was able to conduct spells that were able to draw demonic screams out of thin air without the expenditure of manpower, fuel, equipment, or stereo system investment. So he proved that the occult was cost effective. So when he returned to the United States, he was made the satanic chaplain of the United States Army officially. And there has been a satanic chaplaincy ever since. Now, anyone who doubts this, I refer them to the U.S. Army's Chaplain's Handbook. Colonel Aquino wrote that handbook. He wrote that in retirement in consultation with the Army. Now, when he was in retirement, of course, because of all of his security clearances, he's never really retired. Many people are in that kind of gray area or position. So when they contracted him, essentially as they do various consultants or advisors, they wanted him to write the chaplain's handbook so that none of the other chaplains would interfere with satanic rituals that would be used in the field of battle to expedite operations. Now, anyone looks that up, they will find that he wrote this after retirement, but he was most definitively the author, and they didn't go to a father, they didn't go to a rabbi, they didn't go to a deacon, they went to a Satanist. And that chaplain's handbook specifically instructs all other chaplains not to interfere with satanic rituals. So that very much is a large part of our Army. It plays an enormous part of our Army as compared to what most people would think. The School of Advanced Military Studies in Kansas is where your Army officers are trained, and that's where one of the major instructors, Lieutenant Colonel Challums, Challums, has been noted for stating that all religions are irrational. They are based on faith, and a lot of people who investigate him will find out that he has been established as a co-religionist of Aquino. Turns out he was responsible for training the officers' corps that was used in Operation Desert Storm within the House of Saud, which I was a part of with the Marine Corps. And that means that all of these so-called Jedi Knights, as they were called, were initiated into a satanic kind of ritual system. Now, this is what radicalized Osama bin Laden. See, the term infidel for true Muslims is not used on Christians or Jews. The term infidel means faithless. So anyone who has an actual liberal progressive reading of Islam does not interpret it as being applicable to other monotheists. So the term faithless is applied to people who are essentially atheistic or diabolic. And what radicalized Osama bin Laden was not that there were infidels in the sense of Christian crusaders with their boots on the ground in the House of Saud, which is, of course, the dynasty which oversees the two holiest sites in Islam, Al-Mecca and Al-Medina, but rather the fact that they were led by a cadre of Satanists and Diabolists. That was when he became a sworn enemy of the United States. So that is the kind of impact and situation that we're dealing with. And in terms of documents destruction, unfortunately, documents destruction has been a standard of government behavior or government, shall we say, just government standard operational procedure for many, many years. And a good deal of this was so that they could hide medical experiments conducted against the United States public. Now, many of these medical experiments were conducted at the Presidio military base of San Francisco, Letterman Army Medical Center, where 25% of all U.S. Army doctors were trained. Now, U.S. Army doctors or any military doctors in the United States, unknown to most Americans, do not follow the Hippocratic Oath. You are not subject to the Hippocratic Oath as a military doctor. This is why some doctors became conscientious objectors during the Vietnam War. If you are trained by the military, which is what military doctors are, they basically are people who can't afford medical school. They enter the military pays for their medical school, they're trained in military hospitals, and they are officers. Their commitment is to mission and operational objectives, or even strategic objectives. Their commitment is not to the Hippocratic Oath, meaning it's not to the good of the patient. This is why they conduct so many experiments on GIs. GIs are essentially guinea pigs to them. Well, a lot of people don't realize they also conduct experiments on people and on civilians, excuse me. So what we have as proof of this, of course, was the fact that during the Clinton administration, he ordered an investigation of the Atomic Energy Commission's experiments on United States civilians. And that was published in 1996 by Oxford Press. It was released under the title The Human Radiation Experiments, and it contains the final report of the President's Advisory Committee that was investigating this level of atrocity. And what they discovered was that the records of much of the nation's recent history had been irretrievably lost or simply could not be located. Only the barest description remained for the majority of many human experiments. And it turned out the Department of Energy claimed that all of its pertinent records of its predecessor organization, the Atomic Energy Commission, had been destroyed during the 1970s, and in some cases as late as 1989. All CIA records are classified. As another example, records of top secret MK Ultra, etc., are not accessible to the public, and maintaining security for the government by keeping secrets from the taxpayers are essentially expedited by federal records management law. It provides for the routine destruction of older records. Thus, in the great majority of cases of destruction, or what is termed quote-unquote loss, requested documents will never be found. It's a function of normal governmental record keeping, quote-unquote, procedures, which is actually a destruction process. But by grace of bureaucratic incompetence, the committee made it clear that its story could never have been told if the U.S. government had not accidentally preserved at least a paucity of records that were eventually retrieved and made public. Now, I was responsible in my own small way for releasing a lot of those documents. I was leaking quite a bit during my time as a Department of Defense research librarian in terms of what was going on. That's how people became aware of many experiments that were conducted right here in San Francisco against its civilian population. So I hope that puts that all in some perspective.
Well, I just think that that's interesting. It made me think of the movie Erin Brockovich, and the guy was supposed to destroy documents, but then he found like some really juicy ones and they were able to get the big settlement. So you were kind of like that guy.
I've never even heard of him, but I'll take that as a compliment. That's well, I feel, shall I say, that I definitely am doing my best to have the public recognize that what we are discussing is of great importance to them. Most people don't want to accept it, and people are exceptionally hostile towards what I have to say, and a lot of it has to do with ego and national pride, and that comes back to the survival of the Third Reich and the way the war went down in terms of the Second World War, why we're still legally at war with the Third Reich, a very different situation from the Empire of Japan, which most people are also unfamiliar with and how that war turned out. And the reason I know enough about the Third Reich in Japan and our war with the Axis as a constitutional republic is there's two factors. One, I was born in Asia. I was born in the Nationalist Republic of China as reestablished on the island of Taiwan. Now, the Nationalist Republic of China was one of the founding member nation states of the United Nations when it was formed in World War II. Now, in World War II, the United Nations was founded in January 1st of 1942, 3 weeks and 3 days after Pearl Harbor. It was founded as an organization of war per Title 42 of the United Nations Charter. In lieu of a constitution, they have a charter. Now, it had a battle flag. People can look this up. United Nations Honor Flag is how they refer to it now. Now, that battle flag was a simple white field with 4 stripes that were blood red. The whole reason for that was to represent Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. And this was something simple so that people could take a white sheet in the field, put 4 red stripes on it with their own blood if they had to, and that way wave it to other resistance fighters behind Axis-occupied enemy lines. Because the whole purpose of the United Nations was to orchestrate resistance armies and resistance movements behind Axis-occupied enemy lines from the Philippines to Denmark. And all of that was done at the Pentagon of the United Nations as an organization of war through the Presidio military base where the United Nations was founded. Now, the United Nations peace offices, its peace branch, was opened in New York in 1945 as talk-down procedures began with the Third Reich in exile and with the Empire of Japan. Now, the peace treaty with...
So was this before we blew them up?
Well, let's put it this way. Let's not use terms like that because that's a rather callous and insensitive term. Okay. But the important thing to emphasize is that the atomic bombs, of course, the United Nations was founded before the deployment by the Americans of atomic ordnance. The atomic ordnance did absolutely nothing in terms of the outcome of the war. It was simply a weapon of terror. To emphasize this, the peace treaty with Japan was not signed until September 8th of 1951 on site, the Presidio military base of San Francisco. People can look this up. Now, the peace treaty that was signed was called the Treaty of San Francisco, and it did not go into effect until the following year, April 28th of 1952. So until the last days of April August 28th, 1952. Until the last days of August in 1952, the United States of America and the Empire of Japan were legally at war. It was war conducted under conditions of ceasefire. The battle continued to rage on mainland China. And when the communists finally overran mainland China, my government, the Nationalist Republic of China, reestablished itself on the island of Taiwan, which still belonged to Japan. It was given over lock, stock, and barrel to the Chinese government in exile for allowing Japanese troops and Japanese bases to maintain themselves on mainland Asia until the fall of the nationalist government. That is why my nation, my government was considered treacherous by the Soviet Union and the United States, and why they voted the Nationalist Republic of China out of the United Nations and brought in the Communist Chinese to replace my government. That was the convoluted conditions of war. And the reason my government behaved the way it did was because it was betrayed in the first place by the United Nations, who was beginning to support the communists during the Roosevelt administration. So my nation was an Axis member nation. My nation now exists in exile. My nation is not recognized by the United Nations. It was one of the founding member states. It is not recognized now as even existing. There are 195 United Nations recognized nations on Earth. The Nationalist Republic of China, as established on Taiwan, which is one of the largest economies in the world, is not recognized as one of them. See, that is already entering the gray twilight zone area, which most Americans are totally unaware of. That's the area we're entering when we speak of the Third Reich. So with your kind permission, dear lady, of course, I'll go into that. But first, do you have any questions about that particular situation?
Well, let's just kind of back up. You know, one of the things that we kind of opened the show with was talking about the occult and, you know, the Church of Satan. And I always was led to believe, well, it's not led to believe, it was a fact that, you know, the whole basis of the Nazis and the Third Reich, or a big part of their movement, was collecting occult artifacts and in bringing in, you know, occult philosophy into their party. And so is there a tie between what was going on in the Presidio and what was happening with Nazi Germany? Absolutely,
but not in the way that people interpret it. The first thing Yeah, the first thing to correct in terms of misconception that is popularly promoted by the United States government is that the Nazis were diabolic or satanic. The Nationalsozialistisch, which is the correct pronunciation for the National Socialists, they were essentially very much an occult movement. They were a pagan movement, and the tradition of the Schutzstaffel, or the SS, went back hundreds of years before the rise of Adolf Hitler. It basically started with Adam Weishaupt and the Bavarian Illuminati. And the Bavarian Illuminati were essentially a schism from the establishment Freemasonic movement. And this schism was very similar to the Protestant schism of Martin Luther from the establishment Roman Catholic Church in the West. So the entire purpose of Adam Weishaupt and his desire to organize a new enlightened movement of the illuminated was exactly the same as Martin Luther's Reformation within Christianity. In other words, Masons, of course, have a very ancient tradition. They ultimately take their roots back to the architects of the pyramids. They are, of course, the same Masons who acted as stonemasons for the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. So they were very familiar with a generations-long keeping of architectural construction secrets. Now, this essentially ossified or fossilized into kind of a very ritualized system, and it became very involved with politics through the building of various secret catacombs for the church's use for funneling various types of objects, some of the reliquary of which you referenced. And because of that, they became kind of the keepers of many secrets and blackmailers of various royal houses throughout Europe. So they had an enormous amount of power as a secret society of essentially non-royal technicians. That was originally their starting point. Well, when they became as basically a kind of a mafia that was extant throughout Europe, then Adam Weishaupt launched his reformation of that ossified kind of established system, and it was known as the Bavarian Schism. Now, when he did that, he actually made an alliance with the Roman Catholic Church. He ultimately is known to have, quote-unquote, converted to Catholicism or re-entered the church. He ultimately was involved with the church towards the end of his life. Now, people never ask why or what was going on. They assume that it was some kind of attempt to hijack the Illuminati movement, which failed. And, of course, you have propagandists such as, I forget his name now, but he is the author of the Illuminati trilogy. Colin, it's not Colin Wilson. It's, I forget his name, but people can, of course, email you or text you as to exactly who it was. But we have people who write the Golden Trigger or whatever it's called. There's all these popular novels that really confused the issue. They began to essentially warp it out of such reality that nobody could understand what was going on anymore. But here's the reality of what happened was that Adam Weishaupt established a pan-European paramilitary organization that brought back the beliefs of the Gnostic Christians. And while he was doing this, he cooperated with the Roman Catholic Church in terms of organizing that paramilitary. That is why the Schutzstaffel, or the SS, and its ranks and its training system are all based on the Jesuits. Adolf Hitler even referred to Heinrich Himmler of the SS, the Reichsfuhrer, as my Ignatius. So you had this Jesuitic holy warrior kind of monastic system that was imbuing the SS with very much a crusader's mentality. And this crusader's mentation process was backed by an ideology of a synthesis or a syncretism, as it's called in theology, of Christian Gnosticism and Nordic paganism. So the idea was, unlike the ancient Norwegian or Scandinavian or Viking berserkers, these were warrior cults of Vikings who believed that they were doing everything for their gods of Odin and Thor and Freya by sacrificing themselves in battle. Their entire life was given to battle. So when the berserkers died in battle, they gave themselves, and only themselves, or what they believed to be quality humanity to the gods, what they considered to be their wives who were burned with them, the various sacrifices they made of other warriors. Now, the Nationalsozialistisch were very different. They were modern, and because of the combination of Christian Gnosticism into their paganism, they felt that they could not afford that level of commitment or self-sacrifice of all of their troops. They needed to maintain their numbers, and because of that, they began to sacrifice what they believed to be quantity within their ideology as opposed to quality. So they began to take the Roma, they began to take the Juden, the Jews and the Gypsies of Europe, the Slavs that were not incorporated as Germanized, such as Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, had been under the order of Teutonic Knights for hundreds of years and were considered quite Germanized. And there were various Slavs and Slavic groups that were accepted into the Schutzstaffel or the SS as a multinational pan-European force. And, of course, there were auxiliaries in the Wehrmacht and regular forces as well. But those that were considered Untermenschen, or people who were considered not worthy of living, they sacrificed them en masse. That was what the extermination camps were for. And the extermination camps went into full effect around 1942. And the entire purpose was to create enough of a rip or a rendering or a weakening of the veil in space and time by the tremendous expenditure of human life force as to bring the old gods back to earth, as to bring Odin and Freya and Thor and the rest of the elder gods into a manifestation once again on our plane of existence. It's one of the reasons why we have such a wave of neo-paganism in the world today. Not that neo-paganism is a negative. It's simply that this was one of the modern movements that allowed for a postmodern expression of that form of spirituality that would not have been possible without that religious war. In the same way that Protestantism is not an evil religion per se, but is a result of nothing less than the 30 Years' War, which was so devastating that there are still areas of Europe that are trying to get over or recover from the devastation that occurred during the 30 Years' War. I mean, this is religious war. Now, the American religious aspect of their war was that the Americans had already become very involved with diabolism at the governmental level, with Satanism, quite some time ago, long before Colonel Michael Aquino. Colonel Michael Aquino could never have become the officially recognized satanic chaplain of the U.S. Army without a tradition of diabolism within the United States. Now, the United States was so prone towards diabolism that they destroyed their own original space program before it. The original space program was started in the 1920s by Dr. Robert Goddard, who was responsible for the modern liquid-fueled rocket, which actually made it out of our atmosphere. It was an extra atmospheric rocket. He launched that rocket out of Roswell, New Mexico. The reason he had to relocate there was he originally was from Boston, Massachusetts, and when he was working with rocketry in areas that were near settlements or residential areas, he became a laughingstock for scaring people to death, destroying property. He was ridiculed. He was driven into isolation. He got some funding from Charles Augustus Lindbergh, who, of course, was famous for later on becoming very much a National Socialist sympathizer, who even relocated to Argentina, or rather his family and he did, after the ceasefire, with many of the National Socialists in exile. Now, through men like Lindbergh and getting a Guggenheim grant, through men like Billy Mitchell originally, who died quite early and wasn't able to help him for a very long period of time, Robert Goddard relocated to Roswell, New Mexico, started a rocketry program, left shrapnel all over the desert that is still being misidentified as alien and extraterrestrial to this day. And, of course, he was ultimately employed by the government for designing a missile program. But then they got rid of him, and they replaced him with a young hotshot named John Whiteside Parsons, also known as Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was a MIT graduate. He, or at least he worked at MIT on contract, as well as various other universities. And Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was in charge of MIT, certainly brought him on board. Now, John Whiteside Parsons was an avowed, outspoken, openly practicing Satanist. Now, he developed solid fuel chemical rocketry. And they kicked Goddard out, took all his funding away, brought in a young Satanist to take over the program. Your entire space program is based on John Parsons' satanic rituals. There is a crater on the dark side of the moon named after Jack Whiteside Parsons, which is the only crater named after a satanic magician on the moon that I know of. And his laboratories, JPL, John Parsons Laboratories, was incorporated into NASA as JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratories, after his assassination. His assassination was when he turned traitor and he betrayed his own nation, stole an enormous amount of government technical secrets, and sold them to, of all places, the nation of Israel. And then he basically was destroyed. There's no other word for it. He was obliterated physically in a mysterious mercury fulminate explosion. Now, he was always working with dangerous chemicals because he was very much an alchemist. He did not consider himself a scientist. He did not consider himself an engineer. He considered himself an alchemist. And, of course, he was a student of Aleister Crowley. As a matter of fact, he ran the OTO Lodge in the United States, Ordo Templo Orientalis. And this OTO Lodge was known as the Agape, which is simply the Spanish word for love, the Love Lodge, because he was a sex Satanist. He was basically someone who was involved in orgies and served demons that were interested very much in the indulgences of the flesh. So he ultimately became poor, which is why he had to steal government secrets and sell them to Israel to make money. He became poor because his enormous estate and all of his money that he inherited from his parents was stolen by none other than another Satanist, L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard was essentially a fellow practitioner, and what happened was that he got a woman involved with Jack Parsons. They tried to conduct what was known as the Babylon ritual. The woman's name was Marjorie Cameron, and they conducted this ritual in an attempt to give birth to the Antichrist on Earth and usher in the new age of Antichrist. Now, while Jack Parsons was involved in basically an affair with Marjorie Cameron in an attempt to breed the Antichrist, L. Ron Hubbard ran off with his wife and all of his life savings. And that's how he organized the Church of Scientology. That's the whole story behind that. So all of this I'm very familiar with through Aquino and my years of liaising with him under orders.
I mean, this is just crazy. You know, people say there isn't some kind of global conspiracy going on, but it seems like there's connections going on from this person to this person to this person, country to country to country, individual to individual to individual, that none of us are really privy to.
Well, it's not nearly as complicated as many conspiracy peddlers try to make it. And this is why I differentiate myself from a conspiracy peddler. There is nothing that I am saying before our listenership that cannot be vetted. Anyone can look up every single thing I say and will find that it is documented again and again with verifiable documents. I'm not referring to any inside source just for the sake of an inside source, even though I myself was acquainted with the narrative through an inside source. So though I'm acquainted with the narrative and have a narrative in which to contextualize all of this and make it make sense, that is the problem with most investigators. The majority of investigators are outsiders looking in. And because they're outsiders looking in, they're not whistleblowers. They're simply investigators trying to piece together a puzzle, and most of them come away with something that is just incoherent, like Robert Anton Wilson. That was the name I was trying to think of. Robert Anton Wilson was the man who wrote the Illuminati trilogy. He was actually a paid propagandist who was employed by many elements within Freemasonry to produce that work, to confuse everyone with identifying, of all things, H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos with National Socialism. So that is part of the great disservice he provides, because his novels were read pretty much as a staple on campuses throughout the United States and Western Europe for generations. And people accept it as real. People honestly believe that Robert Anton Wilson, who was a satirist, was essentially writing genuine history. And of course, as far as I'm concerned, his writings are illegible. I've never really reviewed them, but I do know their contents, and I'm never going to take the time to review them, because I believe that that they're pretty much beneath me with what I already happen to know through hard experience. But at any rate, dear lady, I do look forward to your guidance on this. Shall we turn towards the Third Reich in exile, or kind of how the Third Reich was able to establish itself in such a manner?
Because there are people that suggest, that the conclusion of World War II, the Nazi party never disbanded, but instead kept up their operations in secret. So, is that a true statement?
Oh, absolutely. And of course, the United States was very much responsible for that, with the mania with which, most of all, Franklin Delano Roosevelt pursued the war. Now, it's important to remember that the United States lost the war in the Pacific. This is why it had to sue for peace. This is why it had to give up its autarky and open up its markets to the Japanese. Now, all of that would take an entirely different interview. We won't go into that right now, but that is something most Americans cannot stand for. They live in a veil and a matrix of propaganda and psychotic fantasy. There's no other word for it. People look up things on Wikipedia. They look up things on Google. All the rest of that. All of that is government owned. Google owns YouTube. Google owns many other research engines. And all of that, of course, is contracted by the government. Google is essentially a government contractor as much as Boeing, as much as any other defense contractor. And it was paid for and funded as a government project in the first place when it was organized at Stanford. As a matter of fact, its original address was google@stanford.edu. EDU. That's a government address. That is a government electronic address. Now, in terms of what's going on with information that people find out, it's meant to keep them in the dark. It's meant to keep them fooled. And they love it because it feeds their patriotism. You can't fool someone in the end unless they want to be fooled. The American people want to be fooled. One of the things they want to be fooled about is the Third Reich. They want to think that
why are we so stupid? Why do we want to be fooled?
I think that Americans want to be fooled because who has the time? It's gotten worse and worse to really investigate and pursue the reality. And what do you do when you find out? This is the kind of apathy that I see in other places. I see it in the Middle East. I saw it in Eastern Europe. There's kind of an apathy of, well, what can you do? What do you do? That's something people say all the time in those areas of the world. In America, they don't vocalize that because we like to fantasize that this is a can-do culture. The reality is, more and more so, most Americans are busy trying to keep themselves fed, trying to keep their loved ones from becoming homeless. The overwhelming majority of Americans do not have time to pursue the deeper realities. Now, those that do, of course, are usually, they have the time because they're unemployed, and they feel powerless in that extent. There's nothing for them to do being unemployed, and in many cases dislocated, unable to retrain, and so they investigate alternative information media. Now, all that's commendable. But with all of the literal misdirection, misinformation that's floating around out there, what they find confuses them more. And when they do find out something that is more closer to reality, it's not like they have some kind of money to expend in some kind of social operation to countermand it. So there's this kind of inbuilt feeling of helplessness, hopelessness, apathy. Now, all of that, of course, is going to be overcome by just changing your paradigm. So long as you're aware, so long as more and more people become aware, then it's over for the establishment. Because what will destroy the establishment is simply the truth. That is why there is such an unforgiving war against whistleblowers. And this is why whistleblowers are pursued as if they are terrorists. This is why they're locked up in prison and denied human rights. This is why they're tortured by all definitions of the Amnesty International regulations concerning what is defined as torture. And this is why I have to live the way I live. I do not own a car. I do not own a home. All of my family is dead. I have no relatives or spouses any loved one left alive that I care about, and that's how I'm able to exist. I do not have a bank account. I don't have anything. And what little I had, I was living out of a bag, was stolen when I was invited by Nexus Magazine down to Australia on the Virgin Australia flight. So I lost everything, what little I had left. So I literally have nothing other than a few firearms. I've got my Marine Corps life insurance with no one for it to go to. And there's various other things like that. But essentially, I'm a man without anything. That's why I can afford to do what I do. There's no one for them to threaten or leverage against me. Now, I myself also have collateral to keep them from killing me personally because of my work with Aquino and what I was able to filch from the United States government. But all of that, we can bring that up in another interview. It would take half an hour to go into that. But, I mean, if you think that what I'm talking about is upsetting, think about what I'm hiding. But at any rate, dear lady, in terms of the Third Reich, what started was at the end of World War I. Without going too much into background history to choke up the entire program, it does need to be emphasized that World War I did come to an end. And when World War I came to an end, that was in 1919. It did not end in 1918. It came with the Treaty of Versailles. Till the Treaty of Versailles was signed, all of the Allies and the Kaiser's Empire, Austria-Hungary, where Adolf Hitler was born, these were all legally still at war. Now, when the Treaty of Versailles was imposed, of course, Germany was forced to accept very harsh preconditions of peace, and that accord demanded that Germany dismantle its armed forces, cede all of its important land holdings to the Allies, signed humiliating documents saying that it was responsible for starting the war, and worse than any of that, the treaty demanded more than $33 billion in reparations from the German people to pay Allied war debts. Now, by the way, that was all recently paid off, finally, by United Germany. And that was the equivalent of, in today's money, of trillions and trillions of dollars. Just literally a cosmic amount of money. Now, periodic payments against this sum, coupled with Germany's own war debts, they plunged Germany and its neighbors into a deep economic crisis that was acutely aggravated by the worldwide depression. Now, keep in mind, all of this was being conducted while German and various other allies of the Kaiser's Second Reich were forbidden from trading on the world market. In other words, Bulgaria, various Kaiser satellite nations, Hungary, Austria, the nations that broke up that were a part of Austria-Hungary, some of them, such as Croatia, etc., all of these nations were forbidden from trading or taking investment from the international community, yet they were supposed to pay all of these debts off. Now, none of this any sane man could expect to be possible. So the end result was the Allies weren't expecting any of it to be fulfilled. They were waging another war to basically make Germany communist. Now, the whole reason people need to ask, why would that be? Is because to take it off the market as a potential competitor. That is why you had such a support by certain elements within capitalism, big businessmen who were supporting the Bolshevik Revolution. This is why you had Roosevelt supporting the communists against my government, the nationalist government of China, which led my government to take the step of ultimately becoming an Axis member state. Now, all of this is because many capitalists in the United States said, we've got to take the Russians with their population. We've got to take the Chinese with their population. Got to take the Germans with their technology off the market as competitors. So for that reason, communist revolution was instigated and supported throughout much of the developed or developing world. And it succeeded to an extent. Now, it didn't succeed in Germany. Of course, you had many veterans who formed proto-National Socialistic organizations, the Freikorps, and they basically, as militia units, combated the communist insurgency and basically liberated, in Adolf Hitler's first military victories as leader of some of these Freikorps, various German cities that were occupied by communists. But what really brought them into power was the Reichsmark. Now, a lot of people don't realize this. Obviously, Germany was going through an enormous hyperinflation, etc. Now, that's an enormous amount of time for anyone to exist pushing wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread. That can't last too long. And it didn't. A lot of people think of that as going until the Nazis came to power in 1933. Well, between 1919 and 1933, that's a long time. That's the equivalent of a second 30 years war in Europe. So what was going on through all that time? What even led to a stability enough where the National Socialists could be voted into power? What led to that stability was the Reichsmark. And what people don't realize is the Reichsmark was instituted, brought into use unofficially during the year of my mother's birth, 1923, or very shortly thereafter. And it was introduced and privately printed. It was not government printed. It was an underground currency. Now, it became accepted by the Weimar government as the legal currency of Germany around 1924, 1927. And it was so strong that it stabilized Germany from the bottom up. It would be the equivalent of people in the United States, millionaires like Warren Buffett, suddenly backing a political party that was underground and printing its own currency in competition with the U.S. dollar. But because it would be backed by people who have actual money and property to back it up, then it would become a much stronger currency as opposed to the U.S. dollar, which is fiat and just printed based on nothing. That's exactly what happened in Germany. Now, so stable was the Reichsmark, and people can look this up again. It was used as Germany's legal currency, both east and west, until 1947, 1948. This is years after the so-called destruction of the Reich. Why? Because the Nazis demanded it, because that was able to stabilize the finance and funding of their exfiltration and escape from continental Europe as a coherent government. There were a lot of factors going into that. And one of the major factors was, of course, propaganda victories, such as Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels. People have heard of the Führerballs, or what the Allies called crop balls in Europe. In the Pacific, they were known as Foo Fighters. Now, these were just very large magnesium flares that were remotely controlled, and they were rocket boosted, and the magnesium flares were built all around a general spherical shape, very much like a nautical mine, with spikes sticking out of it to catch a bypassing ship and explode. Now, these all belonged under the administration of the Reichspropaganda Ministry under Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels. Now, all of the National Socialists functioned as a polyocracy. They had multiple empires in conflict, competition, and cooperation with each other as needed for each empire builder. People don't realize Hermann Goering of the Luftwaffe had 20 field divisions of infantry. He had an armored division. This was all Luftwaffe. These were troops on the ground. He didn't need to call for any ground support when he was conducting an assault. Now, the SS had their own air force. It was the Hitlerjugend, flying various rocket craft that were meant to fly and be abandoned as soon as they discharged a number of high explosive charges against incoming U.S. bombers. The Hitlerjugend would parachute out and land on Earth to enter another craft. This was all Schutzstaffel, SS connected. All of these people had their own resources. Goebbels, he controlled the Führerballs, and these were used to buzz Allied bombers and throw the Allies into a panic. And, of course, the National Socialists approached the Allies with a very real fact that they were the first state to ever have national television. And they claimed that their television signals, which traveled at the speed of light, had been intercepted by aliens. And that the aliens, since they were first contacted by the Third Reich, recognized the Third Reich as the only legitimate government of all planet Earth. They could only recognize one government, and they recognized the first contactee. So because of that propaganda victory, Goebbels was able to organize a mass evacuation of the Nazi high command while the Allies and the British stood back helplessly, thinking that they had alien firepower to back them up if they interfered. Now, it went way beyond that, of course. There were all kinds of other threats that the National Socialists had, which allowed them to evacuate. And one of them, of course, was simple chemical weapons. On March 23rd through the 24th of 1945, the Allied armies in the West launched Operation Plunder. and that was an assault crossing the broad Rhine River. And it had been significant in German history since Julius Caesar built a timber bridge over it more than 2,000 years earlier to invade the Germani tribes' territories. And they were reinforced and sent in with gliders, the 17th Airborne, British 6th Airborne divisions, and they were across the Rhine in strength. Now, at that point, Adolf Hitler ordered the deployment of lethal nerve gas, known as Taebun, to be unleashed against the invading armies in the West, against Great Britain itself. Now, I.G. Farben had secretly developed the gas. Neither the Allied armies or the British civilians had any protection. Gas masks wouldn't help, and the Taebun was loaded onto the Germans' 46-foot missile, the V-2. And it could wipe out the population of London. This is why the Allies never advanced any further. This is why they stopped cold, and the Germans were able to take on an attack on Berlin by Stalin's forces, the communists only, and battle them to a standstill. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers died in Berlin, and the Russians were stopped cold. People tend to forget that the Reich's division between the Allies and Eastern Germany was an enormous operational victory for the Reich. Now, because the madman, known as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had declared unconditional surrender as a demand, and because Truman, who was naive enough to follow up on that insane order because he was a vice president who had served for literally only 2 months before he became president. The first president was a card-carrying communist named Wilson, who they had to throw out of office because he was going to collectivize all of U.S. agriculture upon Roosevelt's death. So they replaced him with Truman. Now, Truman had never met Roosevelt. He met him twice, only for photo ops. He knew absolutely nothing. So when he became president, he just did whatever he was ordered to do by Roosevelt until he got a better grasp of what was going on. And, of course, he followed up with unconditional surrender demands. Now, all they could do, since they declared the National Socialist Party to be an illegal group of criminals, a criminal state, then they could make no deals with them. They cut off all opportunity for diplomatic coordination with a surrender. You cannot take a surrender from someone you do not recognize as a legitimate government. All you can do is exterminate them. So unconditional surrender equates to genocide. This is why the Germans fought to the last. And this is why the Allies ultimately could never win. So when the Allies both wound up occupying Central Europe, nobody in terms of the National Socialist High Command as party members were basically on the dock. Only military men were. They could only take ceasefires from military forces in the field. The last Führer of the Third Reich on the surface of the world in terms of continental Europe was Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz of the Kriegsmarine, or the German Navy's U-boat or submarine service branch. The reason why was because he had organized the largest evacuation in the history of mankind, Operation Hannibal. He evacuated thousands and thousands of Germanic peoples out of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic littoral, before the invasion of the Soviet Union. So, because he was in charge of evacuating all of these civilians, millions of whom disappeared, it's important to remember that before the end of the war, in terms of proactive, belligerent hostilities, before there was a ceasefire, there were 180 million Germans in Europe. And after that ceasefire, suddenly, when you today take a look at the statistics of Austria and United Germany put together, you have 100 million German peoples. 80 million people disappeared. So in the middle of all that disappearance, where did they all go? Well, over 1 million were relocating. And these were people who created an exile government. And that exile government still exists today. Now, physically.
Are they in Argentina?
Originally it moved in. Elements of it are still in Argentina, of course. I mean, up until the 1970s. a lot of Americans are not aware of this, but up until the 1970s, during Oktoberfest, a German holiday, of course, Buenos Aires would look like Berlin, 1937. All the old uniforms would come out. The Hakenkreuz, or the Hooked Cross, the swastika flag, would fly over the streets. They would hold National Socialistic parades down the main avenue of Buenos Aires. You would think you were in Berlin during the 1930s. There is still a very heavy Germanic influence throughout Latin America after the ex-migration of many people from the Third Reich. But they were welcomed all over the world. People don't understand this. To the world outside of the West, or Mother Russia, outside of Mother Russia, Serbia, a few pockets of very deeply held Slavic resistance. Most of the other people in Europe considered the National Socialists as liberators from both communism and capitalism. Then, too,
hey, Douglas.
Yeah.
Can I break you here? Because we need to go to a commercial break.
Oh, of course.
Okay. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and we're here talking to Douglas Dietrich. His webpage is douglasdietrich.com, and we'll be back with Douglas after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.
You're listening to IRN, the Inception Radio Network, Chicago, Illinois.
Hi, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Just a reminder that Inception Radio Network is on Twitter. Follow us at I_R_N and keep up to date about who's on tonight, what interviews they'll be doing, who's guest spotting, what topics they'll be covering. Tweet to us, tweet about us, retweet topics to your friends, and most importantly, never miss a great show again. That's I_R_N.
Go deep inside yourself and venture into the realm of the unconscious mind with my Meditating on the Kabbalah guided imagery audio CDs. Discover who you are and what you want in life. Meditating on the Kabbalah can help you to open, clear, and revitalize the energetic pathways of your subtle being. They will support you in your spiritual quest by helping you to access the profound insights and inner guidance you need as you work in alignment with your highest good. Let them help you to release negative thoughts and emotions and clear away any limitations that may be keeping you from experiencing your full potential. Walk down the path to health, healing, understanding, and enlightenment with Meditating on the Kabbalah. Order your copy today at www.soulhealer.com. That's right, that's www.soulhealer.com.
Don't have a computer? Is your internet connection down? Don't worry. Use your trusty landline or cell phone and dial or call and listen lines at 832-280-0830 or 786-837-2262 to listen to the Inception Radio Network 24/7. Again, those numbers are 832-280-0830 or 786-837-2262. For the Inception Radio Network, I'm MJ.
Who were the gods of antiquity? They've been described as the forces of nature, levels of consciousness, and aspects of our psyche. Stories that depict their incredible weapons, their flying machines, and their amazing adventures are characterized as being the product of our ancestors' fanciful imaginations. But what if the tales of the gods are true? Did the writers, chroniclers, and scribes of our distant past actually document a realistic view of our origin? My latest book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, looks at our most ancient legends. Learn of the torrid romances, elaborate plots, violent scandals, and conspiracies that played out in antiquity. Find out the role the gods played in the life and culture we have today. If you want to find out the truth of who we are and where we come from, order your copy of Man-Made today. For more information, go to www.manmadethechronicles.com. That's www.manmadethechronicles.com.
Hello, Inception Radio Network listeners. Would you like your favorite show to be played live on air? Well, now the choice is in your hands with IRN's Live Request portal, an easy way to request your favorite show with a simple click. IRN's Live Request portal now gives you exclusive access to all the shows. How easy is it? Simply type a show name or a guest name, click requests, and even write a dedication message. That's it. Try it now. Simply visit InceptionRadioNetwork.com, click on the Live Request tab under the show menu. Playing your favorite show is just a mouse click away.
Move past the crossroads in your life and discover alternative solutions to your deepest concerns at soulhealer.com. So whether it's a physical problem, an emotional issue, a question about work, or troubles in your relationships, naturopath and medical intuitive Dr. Rita Louise can help you. Bring peace, harmony, and health back into your life. Schedule a session today. Visit soulhealer.com right away and live the life you've been dreaming of.
Do you have a smartphone? If so, Inception Radio Network is the best app for you. Available on iTunes, Android, Samsung, and most other app stores. Just search Inception Radio Network. With the app you can listen live, check out podcasts of recent and past shows, view our videos, see what shows are coming up, who the guests are, and, via the chat room, send live questions to those guests. You know it makes sense. Check your app store now. Inception Radio Network. I'll see you there.
And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and you're listening to Just Energy Radio. I think I said that. Echo. Anyway, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. Don't forget, check out the Ancient Mysteries conference.com site about the trip to Angkor Wat. The end of March 2014. It is going to be so awesome. And discount tickets are available, so please do check it out. And if you don't know how to get to the site, it is on the Just Energy Radio webpage where you can find over 7 years worth of archives. And there's a link on the What's Coming Up section of the webpage. So Douglas, I don't know. We got into this whole conversation during the break that I don't even remember where we left off. And so I know that we were talking about, the Third Reich and their rise to power. But let me just kind of shift gears a little bit here. If they're not gone, if they just, move to somewhere else, then what is their agenda? Let's kind of bring it really into present time, because I have some questions. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about what their current agenda is and what their current activity is. There are a lot of people that make the comment that, they're associated with the whole New World Order thing and, trying to create global dominance. Is that what you found?
Well, let's put it this way. Thank you very much for bringing that up, because the first thing we need to do is dispense with the normal state of mind that somehow there is a Fourth Reich emergent in the New World Order, quote unquote. It is important to remember, and I think more and more people are becoming aware of this, that the term New World Order was not coined by the Third Reich. It was not coined by the Nationalsozialistisch. The term comes from what was called a New World Moral Order, or a New World Monetary Order, a map of which was drawn under commission of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, in which the United States would essentially split the world with the Soviet Union. That was essentially the idea. Now, that came to a tremendous failure. The Soviet Union ultimately collapsed, and the United States is left basically now in a similar state of free fall. Now, a lot of this has to do with manipulations on the part of the Nationalsozialistische underground. There's a lot of financial manipulation going on. Germany ultimately did reunify. It is a major military power power in Central Europe. A lot of people are under some psychotic delusion in the United States that we still occupy, quote unquote, Japan and Germany. Nothing could be more demented or further from the truth. What the Americans have a base in is Okinawa. Okinawa is a totally separate ethnicity. They're not Japanese. They have a totally different diet. They ate pork and meat, whereas the Japanese were, of course, vegetarians prior to 1945. So the Americans have a base there. The Japanese have been negotiating their withdrawal for years, and finally they will ultimately be withdrawn shortly enough. None too soon for everybody's tastes. Now, Germany hasn't been occupied, quote unquote, since 1990, and that was when the Soviet Union, just before its collapse, along with the United Kingdom and France and the United States, basically signed a peace treaty with both the Eastern and Western German republics on September 12th of 1990. This was after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Now, at that point, the Americans totally withdrew from Germany, and whatever they have, they lease at the behest and at the grace of the United German government for the sake of bringing in troops who get blown apart in Iraq and Afghanistan so that they don't have to take them all the way across the Atlantic back to the United States. So the Germans fix them up, and the Americans bring them back to the VA, which kills them. So that's the situation we've got going there. There is no occupation of Germany, hasn't been for decades, and Americans get out of the fantasy, wake up, smell the coffee, and listen to what the reality is. And the reality is not that the National Socialistisch are running your government. Now, this is another fantasy that it just borders on the absurd. People have this idea that somehow the Bush dynasty was involved with the National Socialistisch. Now, get over it. They were businessmen. I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying they were good people. I'm simply saying that these were basically greedy opportunists. And at their level of rapacity, they were more than willing to deal with das Third Reich, as was, of course, John F. Kennedy's father. The founding father of the Kennedy dynasty was very sympathetic to the Third Reich as a man of Irish background who hated, of course, the British oppression and occupation of the northern half of the island from which he sourced. Now, there's all kinds of politics that were paramount to the contemporary times of the 1930s that no longer apply. Just as the National Socialistisch had organized the Adolf Hitler and Stalin Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, this Nazi-Soviet cooperation pact lasted only a short period of time. It was strictly pragmatic for both parties involved, and the National Socialistisch get along with capitalists and Satanists no more than they get along with communists. They are truly a different economy and a truly different belief system. They are as alien to American comprehension much as the people who resettled the state of Israel are totally alien to American comprehension. The overwhelming majority of Americans have a very religious view of Israel. The overwhelming majority of Israelis are highly agnostic, highly secular. They are originally a nation that was established by atheistic socialists. So while you have people in America who are breeding red heifers for the Israelis to sacrifice when they rebuild the Second Temple, most Israelis look on that as pure psychotic delusion. And they accept the tourism, and they love to have tourists go over and visit the holy site, sure. But, when Americans start talking about this sort of thing, the Israelis just turn away and they blank out, and rightly so. The Americans are living in a totally different reality from the rest of the world, and so too their understanding of National Socialism. Now, in terms of this NOG, or a Nazi occupation government, which the Americans keep speaking of, a Fourth Reich established through the New World Order over the United States, that is so preposterous, I have to laugh, because if that had occurred, everything would work. If you had a fascist government, you would not have less than 1% of your population in the military. Right now, you take the Coast Guard, you take the Department of Defense, which I used to work for. 100,000 people work for the DOD. They're all civilians. They're not in uniform. Now, you take all of these bureaucrats, 100,000 of them, you put them together with all the Marine Corps, the reserves, the National Guard, 60 to 90,000 men and women at sea, everything you put together, and what do you get? You get less than 1% of the American population. It used to be 2.5 million people. With sequestration now, it's closer to about 2 million people. Far less than 1% of the American population. And because of that, it is basically incapable of doing anything of any consequence. They don't have the manpower. They occupy 160 out of the 195 United Nations recognized nations on Earth, and they occupy them with a pittance of a few men and women each. Now, the moment anyone truly, seriously starts to fight back, the entire American empire collapses. And they know that. And the whole point is that if the National Socialistes were in charge, you'd have a mass mobilization and everybody would be working. Now, that's not going on. You live in a totally dysfunctional economy. And because of that, you have to say, well, this isn't fascism, which is what everyone claims. They say, oh, it's fascism. You want to know what fascism is? Go to Asia. I was born in a fascist government. I was born on the island of Taiwan as administered by the Nationalist Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek was a member of the Anti-Comintern Pact of Japan and Germany. When the Americans started sponsoring Mao Zedong's communists along with the Soviets, he had no choice but for the survival of his republic to turn towards Japan. And, of course, he had been trained in both Japan and the Soviet Union. His son, Zhang Jinghua, married a Soviet citizen. He was married to a Russian woman. My mother personally met her. They went to the same hair salon together. And this was Chiang Kai-shek's son who took over administration of the island. And during the time when Nixon went to visit communist China and played the China card and turned 1 billion people against the Soviet Union, or supported them in their struggle against what they considered to be communist revisionism, then the Soviets played their Taiwan card and decided to support the island of Taiwan. That's because Taiwan is like an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It's like 20 aircraft carriers put together. And at that time had an economy much larger than that of mainland China. And we maintained that economic growth for decades. Now, when all of the other Asian economic bubbles collapsed, Taiwan never did. The Republic of Nationalist China maintained an exceptionally outstanding economy and outstanding economic stability. Why? Because they're basically above communism, above capitalism. They're a functional fascist economy, as is Japan in many ways. Japan's economy was never changed or altered after the war, very much a zaibatsu, corporocratic system controlled by MITAI, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, and they decided what would be produced, what would be exported. That's where the government controls the corporations as opposed to the corporations controlling the government, which is what you have here. So this, if you had a fascist government, fascists were running the government, America would not be in a depression. You would have a functional economy because the corporations would not be on corporate welfare, which you are paying for, to bail them out every time they blow everything they've got in their orgiastic indulgences. So that is out of the way, I would hope. And so where are the National Socialists with their functioning economy? They are basically in what is called Unterland. They are not on the surface of the earth anymore. They retreated through a series of conflicts, which are, of course, verifiable and vettable into basically the underworld, quite literally under the ground in self-sustaining communities, originally in entry points through the Antarctic, and then ultimately throughout the majority of the Earth's upper crust. Now, this is something most people find hard to believe, and this is because most people are entirely ignorant of their history. People have been living underground for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And why have they been doing so? Well, if people remember in the 1970s, Gerard K. O'Neill and NASA kept speaking about colonies in space, that they could make basically 500 square miles of land for thousands of residents in cylinder-like colonies that would use solar energy. They would incorporate in these areas businesses, hospitals, schools, churches. Now, this is thousands of miles of vacuum separating these basically industrial and agricultural parks from the planet Earth. And all of this was considered more than possible in a hermetic environment, all oxygen, water, and waste materials undergoing continual recycling. The walls would be padded with earthy material, more than likely lunar soil, which was proven to be quite fertile. Lunar soil brought back by the astronauts was proven to be much more fertile than Earth soil is. So they could take that, and the inhabitants could have a fertile biocarpet for grasses and trees, and many conceptual designs were presented to the public about this before the entire project was basically shut down because all the elite of the United States became much more interested in moving underground. Now, people might ask, why were they concentrating on these space colonies in the first place? Well, believe it or not, they wanted isolated, segregated communities. NASA quite openly thought of penal institutions. They thought of refuges for political dissidents. They thought of disabled-friendly environments where paraplegics could zoom around in very light gravity on ADA-compliant hovercrafts. And the space agency called these the ultimate gated communities. And that's because on Earth, at this point in history, with 9.5 billion of us that are going to be here probably before we have a population crash, that'll top around 2025. So basically here on Earth, it's basically essential that diverse groups live in close proximity. Now, it's hard to live with 5 or 6 billion Homo sapiens, let alone 9.5 billion that we're going to head to before we get a population drop. People can't do it gracefully. So space settlements were considered as an alternative to changing human nature or endless conflict. It was the ability to live in homogeneous groups, as has been the norm throughout hundreds of thousands of years of human existence. Those who couldn't get along could be separated by millions of miles of hard vacuum, which seems completely necessary when you take a look at the conflicts ethnically and religiously that are becoming the norm as we enter a new dark age. So
there was a question in the chat room, and actually they put it in all caps, and they said, Rita, wait, stop him. They have colonies on the moon? And that was from Lisa.
No, the colonies on the moon, I spoke to this, what I would refer people to, and I do take this as an opportunity to kind of plug myself. I do want people to be aware that I will be available for an entire weekend for you to personally ask questions of. I will answer that question, by the way. I will be available for an entire weekend at UFOCon 2013 in San Jose, California. Please go to www.ufocon 2013, ufocon2013.com. Go to that website and either go to the Mutual UFO Network, the MUFON fundraiser on Friday night, or the event throughout the weekend, or both, and you'll meet me personally because I'm only there on the speakers panel. I'm not a presenter. So I have plenty of time to talk to everybody about all the questions that they have. Also, go to my Facebook timeline, facebook.com/Douglas Dwayne Dietrich. I believe I'm friends with Dr. Rita already on Facebook. And
we are.
Yes, thank goodness. And Dr. Rita very gracefully allowed me to post the schedule for tonight's show there. So do check out her Facebook timeline. There is a marvelously intriguing picture of Satan right beneath my post, appropriately enough, with two snake-like legs. that should engage your visual interest while you.
That was my post.
Yes, that's right. Review everything. And what I do want to say is that if you visit the Facebook timeline of myself, facebook.com/Douglas Dwayne Dietrich, by tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, just keep looking at it. There's interesting posts up there already, but I'm going to post probably an entire portfolio on what Dr. Rita Louise and I are discussing today. I may actually hold off on posting it until she's got the MP3 out or when she's got the YouTube out. And I'm going to beg her on bended knee. I will be forever in her debt. Just send me an email, Dr. Rita, as soon as it's up somewhere, and I will post
I'll
that.
I'll post it on Facebook. I'll post it to you or post it on your page.
Oh, please.
That's usually
do.
what I do. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. And so
I'm hoping it'll be up tomorrow morning.
Sounds good.
If I get the file back myself tonight, it will be up tomorrow morning.
Fantastic. But to go back to the moon, also, people do go to DouglasDietrich.com. My first name is spelled with one S, Douglas. My last name is spelled exactly like Marlene Dietrich. I'm a distant relative of the actress. She actually was commissioned to go on an assassination attempt against Adolf Hitler, and they actually rigged up a device to kill him in her vagina because everyone knew that Adolf, by the way, people can vet this. People can look this up. It's all true. Adolf Hitler had a crush on Marlene Dietrich. She was a German expatriate and immigrant, and she, of course, loathed and detested him as a dictator of her nation. But her last name is spelled exactly the same as mine. Just put the words diet and rich together. Diet Rich. DIET for diet, RICH for rich. DouglasDietRich.com. Go over there. And feel free to order the DVD set. It's still on sale, very cheap. 2 DVDs for the price of one, about $10 each, $20 for both of them, with $5 shipping and handling. Unless you're outside of the United States, it's a little more expensive, so a quarter of $100. You will see images and photographs there. You will see absolutely nowhere else. I took actual photographs of human and animal sacrifice victims on site, the Presidio military base, with a black and white camera made in Germany. I learned how to do this forensic photography by majoring in criminology at San Francisco City College. And City College of San Francisco is exactly where Magus Anton Zandor LaVey, the Black Pope of the First Church of Satan, went to major in criminology. The same people who taught him forensic photography taught me. And they just before they retired. And he learned forensic photography so he could join the San Francisco Police Department as an expert on occult crime and evade the Korean War era draft. So again, all of these connections. But at any rate, to get back to the moon,
I know because the chat room is like going crazy. What about the moon base? What about the moon base? So come on, get to the moon base. They're yelling at me.
Well, the moon comes loaded with an arsenal of design problems. It's minus 387 degrees Fahrenheit at night. It's well above boiling by day. It creates serious problems when it comes to watching out, walking outside. It literally cracks, bends, destroys a lot of materials. So its areas, about half the moon is always dark. This restricts solar power available to people on the moon. It very much had a lot of problems that prevent permanent basing. Now, the National Socialistisch were the first people to establish a base on the moon. It is no longer occupied. The reason they were able to do this was because of advanced science that they learned through their particular brand of what we would call multiculturalism, which is very hard for Americans to believe because Americans are raised, as I said, in basically a psychotic matrix of delusion and propaganda. But here's the reality. Basically, in 1935, there was a young Asian Indian. He was a mathematical physicist. His name was Subramanian Chandrasekhar. And Chandrasekhar basically developed the equations that proved that stars of a mass above 1.5 times that of our sun will end their lives collapsing infinitely. So he mathematically proved the existence of black holes. Now, unfortunately, India was underneath the rule of the racist British, the Raj. So when he went to London to present his equations, there was this racist by the name of Sir Arthur Eddington who ran him down, and he was referred to as a yellow nigger, and no one would get his equations. He ultimately had to give up his British citizenship because he was so persecuted, and he got a U.S. citizenship. And he volunteered his services to the U.S. Manhattan Project, and they said, no, we can't trust you because you're colored. So he couldn't get a job anywhere. But the only people who took his equation seriously were the National Socialistisch. Now, combined with this was the fact that they had developed the world's first functional supercomputer. the same year, 1935, that Chandrasekhar came up with his equations, the National Socialists developed a German engineer's Konrad Zuse computer. And with a statistician named Friedrich Zahn, an SS member since 1933, they established a covert Reichs tabulation bureau, and they began to synthesize a computer technology that through I.G. Farburn, which developed magnetic tape, which made the processing system much more powerful. Magnetic tape was more useful than punch cards, which were much more expensive. And with the use of magnetic tape, these computers did the work of 300 clerks with only 15 specialists in a week instead of 6 months. Now, because of this, they were able to game out the war, game out when to withdraw, when to evacuate, but beyond that, they were able to put Chandrasekhar's equations into use and take them to their logical conclusion in physics. This gave them a 500-year leap in physics. Now, because of that, they knew about the center of our galaxy being a supermassive black hole. That is where the term Die Schwarzen Sonne, the black sun, comes from. They recognized that the mother of all suns, that black sun at the center of every galaxy, is what keeps galaxies together. And because of this, very abstract, physics conceptualization, they had a view of our universe which took them far beyond Einsteinian revolutions in physics. With this, they incorporated the drive mechanisms that were well beyond simple rocketry that took them to the moon. Now, the base they established was on the south pole of the moon in what is known as the Terminator Line, a twilight zone between the boiling hot solar exposed area and the dark side. And it was on the south pole of the moon that they were able to establish within a crater a viable base outside of the range of those extreme temperatures that was able to access the water on the moon that was taken out of the lunar rock. And they provided themselves both with power and with a colony. Now, they had to constantly reestablish a logistical supply line to that colony. That is when the United States recognized that this was a supreme threat to American security because they were still legally at war with the Third Reich in exile, and the 1,000-year Reich in exile was going to be on the high ground from where they could lob missiles, from where they could lob anything onto the earth just from the moon, which is right next door. So what the Americans responded with was essentially a nuclear attack. This was known as Project Argus. And Project Argus was launched specifically to destroy the National Socialists' space capabilities. Now, anyone who looks up what I'm saying with Project Argus will find out most of the technical details they need to know. They will not understand the purpose behind it because it will look absolutely senseless. So to put it into perspective for people, it was a nuclear attack that took place by launching 3 major strikes into the sky to create an artificial Van Allen radiation belt. This was all under the supervision of Nicholas Christofilos, a mad genius who didn't even hold a physics degree. Last name spelled Christofilos, an American scientist, worked at California's Lawrence Radiation Laboratory at Livermore on techniques to harness and control energy released in hydrogen fusion reactions. Now, there's no known physical materials in the world that could contain super hot plasma involved because that was the same temperature as the sun. So he worked on fashioning magnetic bottles. And these magnetic bottles were energy fields, quantities of charged particles would leak out from the ends of these magnetic fields, much like how we get the aurora at the different ends of the Earth's magnetic field. So this individual was in charge of a nuclear attack against the National Socialist space program. On August 1st of 1958, they tested a 4-megaton H-bomb, which exploded 48 miles above Johnston Atoll in the Pacific. The resultant blast basically rose above the atmosphere in a fireball. It created a magnetic storm that blocked out radio transmissions all the way from Tokyo to San Francisco. So on August 27th of 1958, they launched the first of 3 nuclear shots over the Antarctic, where the National Socialistisch were currently based. And one rocket basically carried a low-yield atomic warhead 200 miles above the Earth, and they followed up with 19 separate rockets to measure the radiation. And they did this 3 times, on the 30th of August, the 6th of September. Now, these explosions in the ionosphere were so intense that they destroyed the product of billions of Reichsmarks that the Third Reich had expended on the military space program. The high-energy radiation effects in space, the worldwide radio noise, the intensification of the ionosphere's radioactivity was lethal. They basically, you have to understand that in space, there is nothing which dissipates or absorbs the radiation. When the high-energy electrons strike any object, they generate X-rays which are penetrating. They damage electronic equipment. They erase computer memories. They're lethal to astronauts. And since the radiation belt was global and extended outwards for thousands of miles, all the orbiting satellites that the Third Reich had put into orbit before Sputnik and frequently kept passing through these regions of intensified radiation, they died in orbit. And the implications for the Third Reich in exile for the use of space as a future field of operations was devastating. It showed how vulnerable the entire range of military space equipment really was, even with moderately sized warheads. So the Third Reich retreated at that point into an entirely subterranean existence as opposed to extraterrestrializing itself by establishing bases on the moon. And on the 31st of October, on Halloween Day, 1958, the United States and the Soviet Union began a moratorium on the above-ground deployment of nuclear weapons. And the reason why was because they realized, what's the point of having a space race other than for propaganda purposes? Because if either one of us goes to war, we can wipe out each other's space assets so quickly that all the money we expended would have been useless anyway. That is why the Soviets and the United States had such lame space programs, comparatively speaking, to what they could have had. They realized that it was so useless to invest in something that could be taken down in a heartbeat. So that's the story of the National Socialistische moon colony, which was known as Lunastadt, or Lunar City. And since that point in time, they retreated to an underground existence. And I can go more in that direction if you wish to, dear lady.
Well, just a little minor thing. Underground existence on Earth or underground existence on the moon?
On Earth. The moon base, the what were known as Raumänner, the Reichsterm for cosmonaut or astronaut, they all died a terrible death, as far as anyone knows, on the lunar base because of lack of resupply.
So, I'm asking a very specific question because I have a follow-up question about the underground base, but it's on the Earth and not the moon.
Yeah, the underground bases are on the Earth. The moon base was more of an exposed base. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I want to do a follow-up question, but I also have another question that I'm hoping we can get to, and we only have about 20 minutes. Okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm just kind of giving you the clock here. Okay. So, and I'm going to give you both questions so you can just kind of put them in the back of your mind. Okay. So you mentioning underground bases on Earth, and then there are the like David Icke people and whatever that talk about the whole reptilian thing and they're under the Earth and, the whole UFO culture. I'd like to hear your comment about that. And then the other question that I would really like to ask, it was like one of my most important questions on my list, was what do you think of the Pope Francis who came out of Argentina, and do you think he has Nazi ties?
Well, Pope Francis coming out of Argentina, he most definitively has ties with National Socialism, but only in the sense of the Peronist government. The Catholic Church is very much its own entity. Adolf Hitler, of course, was born a Catholic, and he never retracted his religion. So he was probably still very much a practicing Catholic for years after the war, of which it is certain he survived along with Dr. Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler. And the whole point about Adolf Hitler being a Catholic, it manifested itself most decisively in terms of his forbidding suicide attacks. The Einsatzfahrtkommando are the suicide squads of the Third Reich in their own forms of piloted missiles, etc., were underneath the organizational auspice of the Schutzstaffel under Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, because he was a pagan and he was conducting them technically illegally against the Führer's orders, because the Führer believed that suicide was a sin. And, of course, that was his Catholic background. This is why Adolf Hitler did not commit suicide, was because he believed it a sin which would take someone out of the range of salvation in the classic dogma of the Catholic Church. So you have that as basically one of the factors which explains his behavior in ways that many people don't understand. Now, in terms of the other questions, are you asking if there are other sentient civilizations or species that perhaps the people of the Third Reich in exile encountered in their exploration?
Sure. That sounds like a good angle.
Yeah,
Sure.
well, yeah, that is certainly what the United States government assumes. Now, they can only assume and they can only speculate because the Third Reich's existence underground is very much obviously off limits to any of the surface world. Now, the United States as a government itself, and I know this because I worked with the Department of Defense as a research librarian for almost a decade, the United States government itself basically acknowledges the fact that there are other sentiencies on Earth, in the Earth and its oceans, which cover up the majority of our planet, and that these sentiencies have been here for millions of years. They evolved millions of years before humanity evolved. And that these are what are called relic civilizations or relic populations. Many of them have devolved to the point where they are feral, and the term civilization is no longer technically applicable. There are others that are around that have essentially conquered the solar system millions of years past, and then essentially still have bases or populations on other planets, it is assumed, including underground of Mars, including perhaps the moons of Jupiter or Titan, Saturn's largest moon. There are many things which the U.S. government assumes and some which the U.S. government knows. There are, for instance, definitively artificial constructs on Phobos or the moonlets of Mars. And there's more than two. And the U.S. government has basically taken this as part of its own, shall we say, just secret itinerary. They don't speak about it. I could go into that in depth in another program. And yes, one of these sentiencies is considered to be archaeoavian or descendant from the dinosaurs, basically an evolution of them. And evolutions from dinosaurs are not reptilian. Dinosaurs were not reptiles. They were totally different. They were warm-blooded. And the more that paleontologists find out about these from non-governmental programs or non-governmental funded investigations, the more paleontologists finds out what the government already knew. But many of these civilizations have been around so long, the technology that they're using for the craft that they pilot has long been forgotten in terms of anything other than maintenance. And basically how they learn to pilot them is half a ritual more than it is an understanding of what they're working with. This is why you have crashes in places like South America where bodies are retrieved, etc. So that is a phenomena of ufology. We can go into it at another time. It's assumed by the government that the Third Reich is either in conflict with these intelligences or in some kind of alliance with them. But all formal contact, which was always unofficial anyway, broke off around 1997. That was a while after I left the Department of Defense, which was in 1992. And in 1992 was, of course, when basically the United States government's research-funded projects began to pay off in terms of proving that the underground was more than sustainable to a vast civilization. That's when you had people who were beginning to explore the underground water systems, aquifers. And this is a period of time in which people realized that there is far more water in the earth than there is in our oceans, which cover about 70% of our planet. That water is a corrosive, and it creates enormous cavern systems, enormous tunnel systems. This is what the Third Reich has taken advantage of and has established a civilization in. Now, we have our own deep underground military bases. They are nowhere near as advanced as the Third Reich's are, but it was the Third Reich's exploration in this area that made the United States decide that was going to have to relocate its elite in the underground. This is why the United States actually funded through what they call basically a phantom budget, a black budget, and they do this in foreign nations. And in this case, it was through the Dutch in Nederland. They funded a development of a game known as Killzone, a first-person shooter. The entire purpose of that game was to get people practicing to kill the kind of life form that has evolved out of the National Socialistic relocation underground. That civilization has grown very acclimated to the point where they can no longer tolerate the surface world's light, where they are used to a very different kind of atmospheric pressure, higher degrees of heat, and they are no longer technically human. But they are most definitively humanoid. They could probably interbreed with humans. That is not the point. Eyesight's very different. They have to wear different kinds of lenses to engage in combat on the surface world. They would have to wear the equivalent of an environmental suit in many regards. Not a full spacesuit, but something very close to it or similar, something bordering on that, something similar to a scuba diving suit, even though not that extreme. But basically, certainly, they'd have to be garbed up to function on the surface, just as many people on the surface could not function very well underground because it's hot, because it's steamy. It does rain. It has its own climate, especially in the larger caverns. And that's what they've adapted to. Like mold people or cavefish, they're very different. They're very white. They're not just Caucasian. They're actually white. They've lost a lot of melanin over generations of breeding underground. So the United States, of course, has utilized various forms of propaganda to dehumanize people before, to prepare people for killing them without thought. And the United States does that in many ways so that they can program people towards a violent future. So this was the entire purpose of the Killzone series. I'll go into that more deeply in a column that I'm writing for the Facebook timeline. We could do an entire interview about that in the near future. Okay. But I don't know if you've had any children or know anybody who was involved with it, but they could be able to give you greater details on what I'm speaking of. But hopefully that puts that into some perspective for people. Now, why is the United States doing that? Why on earth would the United States want to go to war with a civilization which has essentially made no moves or threats against it since Operation Argus? The reason why is because our magnetic core is essentially weakening. Solar radiation and the Earth's magnetic field are the reason why we have a sustainable surface. Now, our sister planets, both Venus and Mars, have only weak magnetic fields at this point in their planetary history. That's why they're unprotected from deadly radiation that sweeps throughout the solar system. Earth, on the other hand, has a vast magnetic cocoon, very similar to what Christophilus, the man who launched Operation Argus, was basing his magnetic bottles on. And that's why we have the auroras, where our particulate matter in terms of energy releases through the top and bottom of this very large magnetic bottle that holds in our atmosphere. And this force field has protected us, sheltered us for billions of years on our journey through space from solar radiation. Now, the Earth's core, far underneath the mantle, where the Third Reich has relocated itself, is a vast ocean of liquid iron. It generates this invisible force. And it's what makes our compasses point north, where all of the particulate matter is released from most strongly in terms of the opening of the magnetic bottle, so to speak. But it does a lot more. Keeps us a living planet, blocks the harmful solar radiation. Well, there's massive changes that are ongoing. This is why they are spraying our atmosphere with particles to block the sun's radiation. This is why they're trying to create their own version of a controlled greenhouse effect. There's a storm brewing deep within the Earth that is weakening our vital magnetic shield. And because of this changing magnetic field of Earth, we have a situation in which the elite is planning to move underground. And the first thing they have to do is kill off the Third Reich that already holds it. This is why they've been trying to train your children to fight National Socialists. This is why they still put out movies like Inglourious Bastards, which propagandize against Nazism years after the war is supposedly over. We are still legally at war with the Third Reich, and to prove this to you, every day of your existence, you are impacted by our unlimited state of emergency. There was no such thing as daylight savings time, which is in reality termed wartime, until the Second World War. You had it for a very brief period of time, instituted during World War I. In 1918, it was taken away. Everybody went back to normal life. In World War II, it was started again and would not cease until the war ended. That war has never ended. We are still living on wartime. The overwhelming majority of planet Earth does not abide by a daylight savings wartime. The only people who do were the former allies, the United Kingdom and the former Soviet Union. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the National Socialists ultimately defeated the Soviet Union and the communist flag was drawn down for one last time from the spires of the Kremlin on Christmas Day of 1991. From that point forward, Russia, the Russian Commonwealth of Independent States, does not abide by wartime. There's no more daylight savings times in Russia. The majority of the world doesn't have it. The English-speaking Commonwealth of Nations and the United States are pretty much the only two people still legally at war, cultures legally at war with the Third Reich. They have to maintain it. You can look at
but
your
I
phone.
like daylight savings time. Don't take it away.
Oh,
don't
God, please take it away.
take
Oh,
it
please
away.
take it away. Please take. Don't listen to her. Don't listen to her.
I love
No.
daylight
Oh,
savings time. It
oh.
could be daylight savings time all year long. I
Oh,
like it
God.
being light more.
Don't listen to her. Don't listen to her.
That's
At any
because
rate-
you're like a vampire and you just want it to be dark at night. And see, I
Yes,
like it to be bright and sunny in the
Yes.
daytime.
Yes. Oh, she knows
Ooh,
me
I'm
well.
like your nemesis.
Yes, she knows me too well. She's a creature of the light. Yes, she's a creature of the light.
I am.
At any rate, another thing to look at is your phone bill. Now, during World War II, because we still had ladies, old and young, who were working the phone lines, they would literally take a phone line and physically jack it into a motherboard to make connections. This is how literally we got the term making connections. These were the women who helped us talk to each other telephonically. Now, during the Second World War, they did not want those phone boards that were run by these young ladies to be overwhelmed with the stress of people calling home to find out how their mother or father or son or relative was doing, or wife or spouse or whatever. So they added a wartime tax on your phone calls. Now, this was to discourage civilians from using the phone and leaving it open to government workers and wartime needs. Now, that has never been retracted. All you have to do is look at your phone bill every single month of the year, and you will see a federal government tax on your phone calls. That's because you're making unnecessary calls during wartime. That is just another sign that we are still legally at war with the Third Reich. The war has never ended. The most important sign is the United States cannot declare another war. Now, the war with the Soviet Union, the Cold War, was functionally a Third World War. The United States could never legally declare it because they were still legally at war with the Third Reich, and the Soviet Union was still technically an ally. Now, they couldn't declare war in Vietnam. They couldn't declare war in Korea. These were functionally fronts in the Soviet war. They couldn't declare war in Afghanistan, functionally another front. Now, once the Soviet Union collapsed, they still can't declare war because we're still legally at war with the Third Reich. They cannot afford another war within a war to mobilize. This is why we can never institute a draft and mobilization since the collapse of our ally, the Soviet Union. The draft that we had was still ongoing from the Second World War during the Vietnam era. Once they stopped it, because of mass protests, they couldn't institute another one without declaring another war. Well, we couldn't declare war in Panama. We couldn't declare war in Grenada. We couldn't declare war in Afghanistan or al-Iraq. For that reason, we can't mobilize a draft, and we had to use something we haven't used since World War II, which was our National Guard and our reserves. We've called up everybody for al-Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're deploying them. We've been doing this since Operation Desert Storm. Now, we had to do it, or we wouldn't have even been able to have launched Operation Desert Storm. And all of this without a legal declaration of war. We can't declare war anymore because we're still in World War II. When are the American taxpaying electorate going to wake up and say, hey, we want this war to end? Because the Third Reich in exile, which they keep feeding you propaganda movies about, hate the Nazis, hate the Nazis. If you go to Kenya, I don't know if it's still there, but when I was a mercenary in East Africa, I went into Kinshasa, the capital of Uganda, by crossing the Kenyan border, and there was an enormous statue of Adolf Hitler in the center square. The majority of the world, outside of the West, outside of Mother Russia, outside of Serbia, and outside of the Western European nations and the United States and the Commonwealth, the rest of the world thinks of the National Socialistisch as the good guys. They supported them. They sponsored them. There's been an enormous amount of supplies that went underground to maintain the Third Reich in exile from the non-aligned nations movement, the NAN, which most Americans have never heard of. China is not a member of it, but over half of the world's population is. Its headquarters is in Indonesia. There are more Muslims in Indonesia than in all of the Arab nations put together. It is the largest Islamic nation on earth. More than likely, that is where Adolf Hitler died, was in Indonesia in exile because he couldn't stand the temperatures of the relocation underground, and he couldn't stand the sterile isolation of the Antarctic. Now, all the original National Socialist bases on the Antarctic, which was the reason for Operation High Jump, which would take another program to outline as a military operation, that failed miserably, and that's ultimately what led to nuclear attacks as the last resort. Now, the Antarctic operations ceased and desisted on the part of the Third Reich in exile when they relocated in total, lock, stock, and barrel, underground. Now, their civilization is very similar in terms of its population to the state of Israel. We're talking about 6 to 8 million people, and that's it. But they have an extraordinary lead in technology, and they receive a lot of external support, just as the state of Israel does. Now, this is an ironic analogy, but nevertheless, it is an analogy that functionally is perfect. Their limited population grows because of Project Lebensborn, which is of course, an attempt to breed more and more Nordic Aryans. So they have a population which continues to grow, unlike Israel, which has legal state-sponsored abortion. So they're going in the exact opposite direction. There are more of them than there are, quote-unquote, Hebrew-speaking Jewish ethnic Israelis, of which there are probably about 6.5 million at the absolute most, a little over half of the world's Jewish population. But much of Israel, of course, is Palestinian immigrants who have been given Israeli citizenship, and they live under conditions of a kind of segregation, a kind of apartheid. And the Zionists, of course, have their own sense of ruthlessness. But the point is that there is an immigrant population within Israel, which gives it a population of about 7.5 to 8 million people. That would be the population of Aryans living underground. They are known as intraterrestrial, as opposed to extraterrestrial. And of course, they make scouting runs. Of course, they use their disk craft, which are based on an anti-gravity magnetic propulsion levitation system. And it is many of these craft that are mistaken for extraterrestrial UFOs. They don't really venture outside much at all anymore since Operation Argus. And there hasn't been too much of a need to, though there's been some shows of force that have resulted in enormous damage to the United States, which forced the United States to take them seriously, such as the blackout in New York that took place a number of years ago that resulted in some fatalities and riots. So this is a kind of situation, an impasse, a Cold War, which has been ongoing, and the Americans have lately been trying to mobilize their population to make it a hot war. Otherwise, why would you still have anti-Nazi propaganda films being pumped at you so aggressively years and years after a declared peace?
You know what, Douglas?
No.
I don't have a clue, but I do know one thing. The music is going to come up like in a second.
Yes, ma'am.
So, yes, ma'am. Ooh. I feel so authoritarian. Woo-hoo. Anyway, give out your webpage one more and your Facebook and like that, and then the music, I'm sure, will be playing.
Bless you, dear lady. And Dr. Rita is adored by her listenership and myself. Do have an opportunity to speak to both of you, listenership and Dr. Rita, in the near future. Visit my website, www.douglasdietrich.com. Order that DVD. You will see images you will see nowhere else. And also visit the www.ufocon2013 website. See if you can buy tickets as soon as possible. That's how we make these events happen. Basically, they're all run on a shoestring with an ad hoc budget. Your purchasing of tickets as soon as possible helps to support us making this happen at all. And you're willing, and if you want to, you can make donations. Contact my manageress at Lorian@DouglasDietrich.com, and it's there on my website, DouglasDietrich.com. If you look for contacts, contact her for anything you want to arrange to keep us afloat. And also visit my timeline, Facebook.com/DouglasDwayne-Dietrich. I should have a portfolio up. Hopefully, I'll get it done as soon as possible.
Okay, Douglas.
Put it up with your link. Yes, ma'am.
Big hook. Gotta go, or else I'm gonna be talking over myself. Okay. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I will talk to you off air and in a minute. Okay? All right. That's Douglas Dietrich. His webpage is douglasdietrich.com. Next week, we have Christopher George and Victor Furman, and we are having a ghostly show. We have 3 ghost hunters all in one room. We're opening up the phone lines and talking to you. So listen next week. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio.